In the spring of 1592, Japan sent 150,000 soldiers across the sea to Korea. It took them 19 days to reach Seoul. 19 days. The Korean army fell apart so fast that the king had to flee in the middle of the night, leaving his own people behind. By summer, Japan controlled most of the peninsula. Everyone agreed Korea was finished. Everyone except one man. And his idea was so strange, so ugly, so unlike anything anyone had ever built, that his own commanders called it a floating coffin. His superiors said it was a waste of money. Japanese admirals, when they finally heard about it, laughed. Then he took it to war. 23 battles, 23 victories, not one loss. And at one particular battle, when he had 13 ships against 333, he still won. But before we get to that, we need to go back to understand how a man this brilliant ended up in chains, being tortured by the very king he was trying to save. Korea in 1592 had a problem that goes back centuries. The government was run by scholars. Confucian scholars who believed the highest virtue was loyalty to hierarchy and the study of classical texts. Military men were looked down on. War was considered crude. The navy, especially, was seen as the lowest of the low, something for desperate men and criminals. Yi Sun-sin had spent his whole life fighting that system. He was born in 1545 in Seoul, into a family that had fallen on hard times. He wasn't rich. He wasn't connected. He passed his military examinations at 32, which was late, and failed them the first time because his horse threw him and he broke his leg. He crawled to a tree, tied sticks to his broken leg with bark, and finished the exam anyway. He didn't pass. But he came back and passed the next one. That tells you something about this man. For the next decade, he served in the north, on the Jurchen frontier, doing unglamorous work that no one cared about. He was good at it. His superiors noticed. Some of them promoted him. Others resented him, because Yi had a habit of telling the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. He filed honest reports. He refused to cover for incompetent officers. He refused to play the political games that everybody else played. This made him enemies. In 1589, just 3 years before Japan invaded, Yi was falsely accused of desertion by a rival commander. He was demoted, stripped of rank, made to serve as a common soldier. He did it without complaint. He knew the system was corrupt. He also knew that fighting it directly would get him killed. So he waited. And then, in 1591, something strange happened. A reformist official named Yu Song-ryong pushed through Yi's appointment as commander of the Cholla Left Naval District. It was a distant post, unimportant. Korea's southwest coast. Nobody wanted it. Yi took it. And the moment he arrived, he started building something that nobody had ever seen before. The Chobukson, the turtle ship. Here's what it looked like. Take a standard Korean warship, a panokson, which was already a solid fighting vessel with multiple decks and room for cannons. Now put a roof on it. A curved, armored roof covered in iron spikes. Add a dragon's head at the front that could spray smoke or fire through its mouth to confuse the enemy. Cover the sides with cannons, 26 gun ports, cannons pointing in every direction. And then make the whole thing so low to the water that archers can't shoot down into it. The goal was simple: Japanese naval tactics at the time depended almost entirely on one thing: boarding. Japanese warships would get alongside an enemy ship, throw grappling hooks, pull the ships together, and then samurai would swarm over the sides. Samurai were terrifying in hand-to-hand combat. Once they got on your deck, the fight was over. Yi looked at this and thought, what if they can't get on the deck? The spiked roof meant nobody was climbing on top. The iron plating on the sides meant arrows didn't penetrate. The cannons, pointing in every direction, meant the turtle ship could fire while turning, while being surrounded from any angle. And it was fast. Powered by both oars and sails, it could accelerate quickly in combat. His colleagues looked at this thing and saw an ugly, slow, expensive mistake. "It can't be boarded," one official said, walking around the half-finished hull with his hands behind his back. "Where's the glory in that?" "Glory is for poets," Yi said. "I'm building something that wins." The official filed a report saying Yi was wasting government resources. Yi kept building. He finished the turtle ship in late April 1592. Japan invaded on May 14, 1592. The Japanese force was unlike anything Korea had seen. 150,000 soldiers, organized into 9 divisions, armed with Portuguese muskets that Korean soldiers had never encountered before. The Korean army, which had spent decades preparing for nothing, collapsed almost immediately. Within 3 weeks, Japan held Busan, the main southern port city. Within a month, they were through the mountain passes. By late May, Seoul fell. The king, Sonjo, fled north toward the Chinese border, abandoning the capital so fast that his own palace was burned by his own people, who were furious at being left behind. Korea's only functioning military force left was the Navy, and the Navy was split into 3 commands that barely communicated with each other. Yi commanded the southwest, Won-gyun commanded the south, Yi Ok-gi commanded the southeast. Won-gyun was already in trouble. Japanese ships had attacked his fleet, and he'd retreated, leaving thousands of soldiers stranded on the coast. He sent desperate messages to Yi Sun-sin, begging for help. Here's where it gets complicated. Yi wasn't authorized to leave his district. Korean naval commands were strictly territorial. Moving your ships into another commander's waters required permission from the central government, and the central government was busy running away from the Japanese army. Yi made a decision. He requested permission to move. Permission was denied. He requested again, explaining the situation clearly, laying out exactly why Won-gyun's force was about to be destroyed. Permission was denied again. Yi went anyway. He knew this could end his career. He knew he could be court-martialed. He went anyway because the alternative was letting the Japanese Navy operate freely along the coast, resupplying their army, moving troops wherever they wanted, winning the war. On May 4th, by the lunar calendar, just days after the invasion began, Yi took his fleet, including his brand-new turtle ships, out to find the Japanese Navy. He didn't have to look long. The Japanese fleet was anchored at Okpo. About 50 ships, resting, not expecting any serious resistance. Korean naval forces had been running or surrendering. The Japanese commanders were confident. Yi hit them at dawn. The turtle ship went in first. The dragonhead at the front breathed smoke, a mixture of burning sulfur and other materials that created a thick fog. Japanese archers shot at it. Arrows hit the iron spikes and fell off. Japanese soldiers tried to throw grappling hooks onto the roof. The hooks bounced away or caught on spikes with nothing to hold. The samurai on the Japanese decks had no idea what to do with something that couldn't be boarded. The cannons on the turtle ship fired from point-blank range. Korean Panokson warships followed behind, targeting Japanese ships trying to flee. In the Battle of Okpo, Korea sank 26 Japanese ships. Yi lost 0. That day alone, he fought 2 more engagements. 42 Japanese ships destroyed in total. Yi's losses? Not 1 ship. He returned to port and filed his report. Direct, factual, no drama. He listed the ships destroyed, the positions, the tactics used. He didn't claim more than he'd done. He didn't minimize it either. The report reached the king's court, currently traveling as fast as possible toward China, and nobody quite knew what to do with it. A month later, Yi did it again. Japanese naval commander Todo Takatora had assembled a fleet at Sachon. He'd heard about Okpo. He wasn't taking chances. He positioned his ships in a bay with steep cliffs behind, making it harder to surround them, and waited. Yi arrived, looked at the position, and did something his officers didn't understand. He ordered a fake retreat. His fleet pulled back. The Japanese ships, seeing the Koreans running, did what made sense. They came out of their protected position to chase. Why let them escape? The moment the Japanese fleet cleared the bay, Yi turned his ships around. The turtle ship was already moving at full speed toward the lead Japanese vessels. 26 cannon ports opened. The Japanese admiral watched a boat that looked like a metal turtle bearing down on his fleet with no apparent intention of stopping. Grappling hooks were useless on a spiked iron roof. Arrows were useless on iron plating. Fireships were useless against a vessel that didn't burn easily. The turtle ship hit the Japanese fleet like a battering ram and fired in every direction. Korea lost not 1 ship at Sachon. This was only his 2nd battle of the war. Yi Sun-sin was starting to become someone the Japanese Navy actually feared. Word spread through their fleet. There was some kind of armored ship. It couldn't be boarded. It had to be avoided. The problem was that avoiding it was not easy because Yi kept finding them. 3 weeks later came the battle Yi himself considered most important. The Japanese had assembled a major fleet at the island of Hansan. 73 warships. This wasn't a supply escort or a small coastal patrol. This was a fighting fleet, and if it operated freely, it could move troops along the coast faster than the Korean army could respond, which at this point was almost irrelevant, since the Korean army had basically stopped existing as a coherent force. Yi needed to destroy this fleet. Not scatter it, destroy it. He had something like 56 ships. Again, he sent in a small decoy force to draw the Japanese out of the harbor. Japanese ships in harbor were protected on multiple sides and hard to flank. The decoy worked. The Japanese fleet came out into open water, pursuing what they thought was a retreating Korean squadron. Yi was waiting. He gave a signal. His fleet, which had been out of sight behind islands, turned and formed a formation called the crane wing. It was a crescent shape, opening wide to either side so that every ship could fire its cannons simultaneously, and the formation curved around the enemy to prevent escape. Then he closed the crescent. 59 Japanese ships were destroyed, 59 out of 73. The remaining 14 ran. Yi didn't lose a single ship. At Hansan Island, in one afternoon, Yi Sun-sin effectively ended Japan's ability to resupply its army by sea. But here's the thing nobody mentions about Hansan Island. It's not the most impressive part of this story. The most impressive part is what Yi was dealing with back on land. While Yi was winning battle after battle, the Korean court was doing what Korean courts did best: politics. Yi had a rival. His name was Won-gyun, the same commander who'd begged Yi for help at the beginning of the war, the same one who'd retreated and left soldiers stranded on the coast. Won-gyun was well connected. He came from an aristocratic family. He knew how to work a court, how to make friends with the right officials, how to position himself as the indispensable man. And Won-gyun hated Yi Sun-sin with a kind of intensity that only comes from knowing someone is better than you and not being able to do anything about it. He started sending reports to the king's court, not about battles, about Yi's character. Yi was arrogant. Yi was insubordinate. He'd left his district without permission, hadn't he? Yi was hoarding supplies. Yi wasn't a team player. Yi thought he was better than everyone else. Some of these things were partially true. Yi had left his district. He didn't play political games. He did file reports that sometimes embarrassed his superiors, but the picture Won-gyun was painting of a dangerous, disloyal officer who needed to be watched was a lie designed to destroy Yi before Yi's victories made him untouchable. And it was working. Yi knew it was working. His dispatches from this period are careful, precise, almost legalistic. He documented everything because he knew someone was going to try to use his own words against him eventually. He was right. But he didn't know, not yet, exactly how bad it was going to get. He was still winning. In the autumn of 1592, Yi destroyed more Japanese ships. In 1593, the Japanese army, unable to get reliable supplies by sea, began pulling back from their most advanced positions. The turtle ships had changed the entire shape of the war. Japan still held large parts of Korea, but they couldn't advance, couldn't move freely, couldn't win. A ceasefire of sorts settled over the peninsula. 4 years passed. Both sides negotiated. Neither side trusted the other. And while the negotiations went nowhere, Won-gyun kept sending his reports. By 1597, he'd found the perfect weapon. The Japanese had a spy, or at least someone claiming to be a Japanese spy, who delivered a message to the Korean court. He said a major Japanese general, Kato Kiyomasa, was going to be traveling by sea on a specific date. He would be vulnerable. If the Korean Navy moved now, they could capture or kill one of Japan's top commanders. Won-gyun pushed this information hard. This was the opportunity of the war. The king had to act. The king issued a direct order to Yi Sun-sin. Take the fleet, go to the location, attack. Yi investigated the intelligence himself, and he refused to obey the order. Not because he was afraid, not because he was incompetent, but because he was certain, completely certain, that it was a trap. The water at the specified location was too shallow, too narrow, too easily blocked. If the Korean fleet went there, Japan could seal off both ends of the passage and destroy every ship. The intelligence was fabricated to lure the Navy into a killing ground. Yi wrote to the court and explained this in detail. The court didn't want to hear it. The king had given a direct order. Yi was refusing to follow it. Won-gyun was already there, whispering in every ear that Yi had finally shown his true colors. A traitor, a coward, a man who thought his own judgment was more important than the king's command. Yi was arrested. They brought him to Seoul in chains. He was tried for disobedience and cowardice in the face of the enemy. The punishment was death. Enough voices argued for mercy that the sentence was reduced, but what replaced it wasn't much better. Yi Sun-sin was tortured. Then he was stripped of every rank he held, every title, every honor. He was demoted to the lowest possible status, a common soldier, with no command, no authority, assigned to serve under the general he most despised. He was put in the army, on the front lines, with a spear. In his journal from that period, he kept a journal through most of the war, one of the most remarkable personal documents in Korean history. He didn't write about rage. He didn't write about injustice. He wrote that his mother, who was old, had been traveling by boat to see him when she died at sea. He learned of her death while in prison. "I want to die," he wrote. "I have lost everything." Meanwhile, Won-gyun had what he wanted. He was now in command of the Korean Navy. And Japan was about to invade again. The second Japanese invasion began in the summer of 1597, and it was worse than the first. Japan came back with 140,000 soldiers, lessons learned from the first invasion, and absolute fury. They weren't there to occupy Korea anymore. They were there to destroy it. Won-gyun took the fleet, Yi's fleet, the ships Yi had built and trained, and did exactly what Yi had warned him not to do. He attacked the position Yi had identified as a trap. At the Battle of Chil-Cholyang, Japan was ready. They'd lured the fleet exactly where they wanted it. The channel was blocked. Japanese ships came from every direction. Korean commanders panicked, and ships collided with each other in the chaos. Won-gyun fled to shore and was killed on the beach, cut down by Japanese soldiers. In one afternoon, the Korean Navy was destroyed. 160 ships annihilated. The sailors who'd trained under Yi Sun-sin for years, dead. The Panokson warships, the supply vessels, everything, gone. 12 ships survived. 12. The Japanese army, now resupplied freely by sea, swept through the south of Korea. Cities fell. People were massacred. Japan's generals, having finally eliminated the one force that had stopped them, moved fast. The king's court, which had done this, which had tortured Yi and handed his navy to an incompetent rival, now needed Yi again. And this is the moment that defines his character more than any battle. They sent the order restoring his rank. They sent it with an apology that wasn't really an apology, and with instructions to report to command immediately. Yi could have refused. He had every reason to. They'd imprisoned him. They'd tortured him. They'd gotten 300 sailors killed. They'd destroyed everything he built. He didn't refuse. "A man cannot just stand by," he wrote in his journal, "if he can save his country." He reported for duty. They gave him 12 ships. 333 Japanese warships were coming up the coast. 12 ships. Yi stood on the deck of his flagship and looked at what he had. 12 Panokson warships, a few hundred sailors, most of them untrained, pulled from coastal villages because the experienced men were dead at Chil-Cholyang. No turtle ships. The turtle ships had burned with the rest of the fleet. 333 Japanese warships were moving up the western coast toward Seoul. If Japan controlled the western sea route, it was over. The army would be fully supplied. The capital would fall. The king would have nowhere left to run. Korea, as a country, would stop existing. His officers knew the numbers. They came to Yi with what seemed like the only reasonable suggestion: abandon the fleet. burn the remaining 12 ships so Japan couldn't capture them. Fight on land. "If we have 12 ships," Yi told them, "and I am still alive, the enemy will not be able to look down on us." He sent a letter to the king's court. Direct, no drama. He listed the 12 ships. He listed the sailors he had. And then he wrote one line that the court officials apparently read several times because they couldn't believe he meant it. "I will not die." He started preparing. Yi had been studying the western coast his entire career. He knew every current, every shoal, every place where the tide did something unexpected. And near the island of Jindo, he knew about a strait called Myeongnyang. Myeongnyang was narrow, about 300 meters wide at its tightest point. And through that gap, twice a day, the tide ran at extraordinary speed. When it ran one direction, it was almost impossible to row against. When it ran the other direction, same thing. The current switched directions every 6 hours. Yi understood immediately what this meant. 333 Japanese ships could not all fit through a 300-meter gap at once. They'd have to come through in groups, which meant his 12 ships wouldn't face 333 at a time. They'd face however many fit in the strait. And if the current was running against the Japanese ships, those ships would be fighting the water as well as Korean cannons. He positioned his fleet at the strait entrance and waited. He also stretched an iron chain across the narrowest part of the passage, just below the waterline. He didn't tell his officers about the chain until the morning of the battle. He didn't want the information to leak. On the 19th day of the 9th lunar month of 1597, the Japanese fleet arrived. 333 ships. You have to understand what that looks like. That's not a fleet. That's a floating city. Japanese warships stretched from one horizon to the other, their sails crowding the water, drums beating, flags flying. The Japanese commanders looked at 12 Korean ships sitting at the entrance to the strait and felt something close to confusion. What were they doing? Surrendering? It made no sense for 12 ships to face 333. No sane commander would do that. Which meant either Yi Sun-sin was not sane, or he knew something they didn't. The Japanese admirals sent the first wave in. Yi held his position. He let them come into the strait. He let the current grip their hulls, slowing them, forcing their oarsmen to work twice as hard just to maintain steerage. And then his 12 ships opened fire. 12 ships concentrated in a narrow channel, firing everything they had at a column of Japanese ships that couldn't spread out, couldn't flank, couldn't get around the Korean fleet because the strait's walls were too close. The lead Japanese ships were hit hard, but there were so many of them. More kept coming. The second wave pushed through the first. The third wave followed the second. And here's where Yi's own account of that day gets strange. His flagship was surrounded. At some point in the fighting, Yi's ship was isolated. The other Korean commanders, seeing the mass of Japanese vessels, had pulled back. They were watching from a distance. Yi's flagship was alone in the middle of the strait, with Japanese ships on every side. Yi didn't retreat. He kept firing. Then he did something almost theatrical. He had his crew beat the war drums louder. He had signal flags raised, and he sailed directly at the nearest Japanese warship, closing the distance so his cannons couldn't miss. His officers later said that watching him sail into that mass of Japanese ships, alone, was the most terrifying thing they'd ever seen. But here's what happened. The other 12 Korean commanders, watching their admiral sail into what should have been his death, felt something they couldn't explain. They turned their ships around. They went back in. All 12 ships formed up behind Yi's flagship and charged. At that exact moment, the tide turned. The current, which had been running against the Japanese fleet, slowing them, making them fight the water, reversed. Now it ran against them from the other direction. Ships that had been pushing forward were suddenly pushed back. Captains lost control of their steering. Japanese vessels started colliding with each other in the narrow channel. And then the front Japanese ships hit the chain. Ships that struck it at speed were stopped dead, thrown sideways, blocking the channel. Ships behind them piled into ships that had stopped. The formation collapsed into chaos inside a 300-meter gap with nowhere to go. Korean cannons fired into that chaos from point-blank range. The Japanese admiral, a man named Kurushima Michifusa, who had been at Chilcholyang and had helped destroy Yi's original fleet, was killed when his ship was hit and he went into the water. His body was pulled out by Korean sailors. Yi had his head displayed on the flagship mast. That was intentional. Every Japanese captain in the strait could see it. The Japanese fleet broke. Ships turned around in a channel that was too narrow to turn around in. Ships that had been pushing forward were now trying to go backward, fighting the current, fighting the ships still coming behind them. Some Japanese sailors jumped overboard. Some ships caught fire. By the end of the day, 31 Japanese warships were sunk. Korea lost 0 ships. 12 against 333. And Korea lost nothing. Yi filed his report. As usual, it was direct, factual, no drama. He listed the ships destroyed. He noted the effectiveness of the chain. He reported the death of Kurushima Michifusa. He did not describe himself as a hero. The king's court read the report and apparently sat in silence for a while. After Myeongyang, something shifted. The Japanese advance slowed, not because of the army. Japan still had 140,000 soldiers on Korean soil. But the supply situation was suddenly complicated again. Yi had 12 ships and no base, so he moved constantly, hitting Japanese supply convoys, coastal depots, any Japanese vessel he found. He was rebuilding the fleet at the same time, pulling ships from any source he could find, recruiting sailors from fishing villages. Within months, he had 80 ships. He also had help. China had entered the war on Korea's side, and Chinese naval forces were operating in Korean waters. Yi was eventually given joint command, Chinese and Korean ships fighting together. The Chinese admirals, who had their own navy and their own way of doing things, looked at Yi's record and mostly did what he told them. By 1598, 6 years into the war, Japan was losing. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the Japanese leader who'd launched the invasion, died in September. His commanders received secret orders to withdraw. Japan was going home. But withdrawal by sea meant moving 140,000 soldiers onto ships, and those ships had to sail past Yi Sun Sin. Yi knew about the withdrawal. He knew the Japanese fleet would be gathering at Noryang, a strait in the far south of the peninsula, preparing to escort the retreating army home. He knew this was the last battle. If the Japanese fleet got through, 140,000 soldiers would be safely on ships, and the war would end with Japan having simply given up rather than being defeated. If the fleet was destroyed or badly damaged, the withdrawal would be chaotic, and Japan would lose far more men. He also knew that some Korean court officials were already discussing letting the Japanese leave peacefully. Let them go. End the war. Stop the killing. Yi disagreed. He wrote to the court. He argued that letting Japan withdraw without consequence would just mean another invasion in 20 years. The army needed to be hurt badly enough that Japan wouldn't come back. The court, as usual, didn't fully agree, but Yi was already moving his fleet south. The night before the Battle of Noryang, Yi stayed awake. He wasn't planning tactics at that point. The plan was made. He was writing in his journal. The last entries he made are short. He wrote about the cold. He wrote that he missed his sons. He wrote that he'd prayed. At 2 in the morning, he gave the order to advance. The combined Korean-Chinese fleet, about 150 ships, hit the Japanese fleet in darkness. The Japanese were not expecting a night attack. The chaos was immediate. Ships fired at shadows. The strait filled with cannon smoke so thick that captains were navigating blind. Yi fought from his flagship, directing fire, repositioning ships where the line was weakening. The Japanese fleet was large, 300 warships, plus hundreds of transport vessels carrying soldiers. They fought hard. They had everything to lose. By dawn, the battle was still going, and somewhere in the early morning light, Yi Sun-sin was hit. A bullet, a Japanese musket ball, struck him on the left side, below the armpit. He'd been standing exposed on the deck, directing fire. He didn't fall immediately. He stayed on his feet long enough to say 3 things to his son and his nephew, who were beside him. His son was standing on his right. His nephew was on his left. He grabbed his nephew's arm. "The battle is at its peak," he said. "Do not announce my death. Beat the drums. Wave my flag. Keep fighting." Then he fell. His son and nephew looked at each other. They covered him with a shield. They beat the drums. They waved the flag. They kept fighting. The Korean fleet didn't know their admiral was dead. The Chinese fleet didn't know. The Japanese fleet didn't know. The battle continued. 2 hours after Yi fell, the Japanese fleet broke. The withdrawal turned into a rout. Japan lost 200 ships in the final accounting. The soldiers on shore, watching their navy destroyed, had no way home. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers were stranded. When the battle ended, Yi's nephew announced his death. His son, standing next to his father's body, reportedly let out a single cry. Then he stopped. His father had given an order. They'd followed it. The battle was won. The court finally acknowledged what Yi had done. The king, the same king who'd had him tortured, stripped of rank, and sent to the front lines as a common soldier, gave him the highest posthumous honors available. He was declared a national hero. Ceremonies were held. Statues were planned. Yi wasn't there to hear any of it. The Japanese army, stranded without its fleet, surrendered or was destroyed in small groups over the following weeks. The invasion of Korea, which had begun with 150,000 soldiers and 19 days to Seoul, ended without Japan holding a single piece of Korean territory. What had changed? Not the army. The Korean army had collapsed in the first weeks and never fully recovered. Not the politics. The Korean court had spent 6 years trying to undermine its own best commander. What had changed was the sea. Yi Sun-sin had fought 33 Japanese warships in his first engagement and lost nothing. He'd destroyed 59 ships at Hansan Island. He'd faced 333 with 12 ships at Myeongyang and lost nothing. He died at Noryang, still winning. 23 battles, 23 victories. The turtle ship, the ugly, expensive, unboardable floating coffin that his colleagues had laughed at, had never lost in combat. Not once. The spiked roof meant samurai couldn't board it. The iron plating meant arrows bounced off. The cannons pointing every direction meant there was no safe angle to approach from. The officials who'd called it a waste of money were alive because of it. After Yi died, his fleet found his journal among his belongings. He'd been keeping it for years. Through the battles, through the political attacks, through prison and torture and demotion. Through the death of his mother at sea, which he'd learned about while he was locked up for crimes he didn't commit. Through the morning he got his rank back and had 12 ships and faced 333. The journal wasn't dramatic, it was honest. He wrote about being tired, about missing his family, about not understanding why the people he was trying to save kept trying to destroy him. About the days when he genuinely didn't know if he could keep going. And then the next day, he'd gone out and done the job anyway. Won Gyun, the man who'd schemed against Yi for years, who'd finally gotten him arrested and tortured, who'd taken command of the fleet and destroyed it in a single afternoon. Won Gyun died on the beach at Chilcholyang, cut down by Japanese soldiers while fleeing the battle he'd caused. He never saw Myeongyang. He never saw Yi come back with 12 ships and win. But the Japanese admirals who survived Noryang knew exactly whose fleet had just destroyed them. They'd been hearing Yi's name for 6 years. They'd been trying to avoid his ships for 6 years. The samurai who'd watched grappling hooks bounce off iron spikes knew whose idea that was. In Japan, after the war, some commanders who'd fought against Yi wrote accounts of the battles. Their descriptions of him were not the descriptions of an enemy. They were the descriptions of someone who'd beaten them so thoroughly and so consistently that respect was the only honest response. One Japanese commander, writing years later, compared Yi to the Chinese admiral he considered history's greatest naval strategist. He said Yi was better. The turtle ship that everyone called a floating coffin never lost a battle. Yi Sun-sin, the man who built it, went to prison for refusing to sail his fleet into a trap. He came back from prison with 12 ships and faced 333. He didn't survive the war. Korea did.